And one thing that we've seen time and time again is that you cannot trust record companies and their various intermediaries to safeguard the monies that you're supposed to receive if you're a beneficiary of an artist.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
So now we're picking up with the rest of the Buddy Holly story. So if you've not watched the first episode, be sure and watch it. We talk about his life and some very interesting things about his success, as well as, of course, his death. Many of you know, if you're Buddy Holly fans, you'll know a lot of this, but I'm convinced there's information in there that you probably don't know. But in any case, we want to pick up with this show, and we want to talk about what happened after his death. So we want to talk a little bit about estate planning. We want to talk about the assets. We want to know who the heirs were and kind of what happened to those assets and those relationships thereafter. Buddy Holly died, as we mentioned, in February of '59. It was something that was unexpected. You might have known that without my telling you, but when somebody dies at age 22, it's so unexpected by them that it's unusual to have estate planning done. Now, you may be 45 and you don't expect to die, but certainly you know that there's lots of things that can take you out, from health to planes to other forms of accidents or mishaps. But at 22, generally, people don't do estate planning because they don't see it coming. They think, I've got a decade at least, several decades. They don't buy life insurance for sure. Sometimes that's because they don't have any people who are dependent on them. But in this case, Buddy Holly, we know he was married. He had married approximately a little less than 6 months before. He had a child on the way. We know these things. So when he dies, he's at a point in his life where he's not anticipated this particular massive improbability. So there was no will, and he was a resident of the state of New York at the time of his death, which will be the effective fact as opposed to where he died. So New York laws of intestate succession say that under his circumstances that everything goes to his surviving spouse. Now, intestacy laws don't say that in all states. Some states will have a provision where there are no children and surviving parents. They'll take maybe a third, some states even a half under some circumstances and give it to parents. But New York at that time, and I suspect even today, but I'm not sure about that, because new intestacy, a uniform law has been since adopted in virtually all the states. So, but at this time, that was not uncommon. So everything goes to this very new wife. So if you put yourself in the shoes of his parents, you're thinking, there's something not right about this. We raised our son. He loved us, certainly, even though he loved this woman. But he created, these are his creations. And the idea that it goes to this newcomer who his parents, in fairness, didn't really know how much she loved him, meaning that they might have had reasons to question her motives. Although, as we described in our last show, the shock and devastation to her that is adequately demonstrated makes clear that she was, head over heels in love with her new husband. But in any case, the parents were not pleased with this result. We don't know what words were exchanged, but we do know something that says something very good about Maria Elena, which is his surviving wife, his widow. So she decides that she's going to give half of the value of any intellectual property to the parents. So that's quite a gift. Remember, she's very young too, just like her deceased 22-year-old. And I'm assuming she's around 22, but the point is she's very young. And so I think that this was a good demonstration of good faith. Certainly she didn't have to do this, but she did. So the other assets that were in the state, there weren't much, although Buddy had started making a lot of money around that time. So we talked in the last show that he's had 7 hits that have charted between 57 and 59. He's getting at this time $60,000 to $80,000 in royalties, which if you go back to, it doesn't sound like much today. 1959, that's That's a ton of money. So he's comfortable, and there's money flowing in currently when he dies. The question is, will that money be adequately accounted for thereafter? And one thing that we've seen time and time again is that you cannot trust record companies and their various intermediaries to safeguard the monies that you're supposed to receive if you're a beneficiary of an artist or someone who has left to you these royalty rights or this intellectual property rights. You can't count on whatever entity is controlling those to do the accounting and send you the checks as is required legally. Now, I'm sure it happens sometimes, but I can tell you, doing this show as we have in these topics for the last 7, 8 years, I mean, it's just a recurring theme that somehow the books don't get it right. And sometimes it's because of bad intentions. Other times it may be indifference that's born of no real motivation to get it right. And sometimes it could be a simple good faith mistake. But the bottom line is that when people inherit intellectual property, it's incumbent upon them to police it and to have their own representatives who assure that payments get made. A further example of this, and you'll see an episode about it soon, is Travis Campbell, who's the son of Glenn Campbell. He was awarded through his mother, her death, certain rights relating to royalties for the biggest hits. The most successful songs that Glenn Campbell had came to after his mother's death to Travis and his siblings. And their mother had been the first wife of Glenn Campbell. So I mentioned that because I want you to be sure and follow up and watch that episode. We haven't done that second episode. We're still assembling the court documents and all the things we'll need to make that. But it's a great illustration of this point where you can't count on these other parties to pay you what you're supposed to be paid. And if they can avoid paying you hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of dollars, unfortunately, that's often what happens, especially when there's bad blood, when it's the children of a divorced spouse or just the divorced spouse. Often there's this contentious relationship anyway. And if it's the business manager of these stars or some representative of the record company that maybe didn't like this person from day one, and now this person is the widow. So there's just lots of reasons that the books can't be counted on if they're being kept by the record companies in terms of these payments. So it's not surprising for you to hear that the primary asset for this 22-year-old, pardon the phrase, boy, is intellectual property and the fame that he's accumulated. So it was imperative that people be around these beneficiaries to assure that it's gotten right. Now, sadly, it wasn't right for quite a while. Ultimately, there was a lawsuit. There was arrearage paid. In one case, I think it's $500,000, and I don't know what other payments may have been made. But you can see it. We're talking a significant amount of money, especially when we're talking in mid or latter half of the 20th century. One thing that is worth talking about, though, which is a little bit of a different discussion that I want to be sure you understand when we're talking about people who are famous or artists, is we tend to think of what's being at stake as these intangible assets being just intellectual property. Lawyers call it IP, and there's a field of expertise in the law called IP law. And as you might imagine, it can be very complicated. Intellectual property relates to things that are the product of creativity or innovation or some, as the word implies, intellectual contribution. So that now is largely governed through federal law. We have copyright law, we have patent law, we have trademark laws. So we have laws that are federal, that are intended to protect people when they create things. And these things can be in the nature of art, which is the subject of this show, but it can be in the nature of patents on wonderfully useful, world-transforming things. And the incentive to create these patents, and even the incentives with copyrights and other things, it is feared in terms of a societal policy, it's feared that if these are not protected and there's inadequate incentives for people to expend what often is laborious, extraordinary efforts to accomplish these things, if there's not an incentive for them to do that, the fear is that society may never see these things developed. So it's a longstanding public policy in the Western world, at least, that you protect these things. You want to incentivize people to create great art, to write wonderful songs, and especially to make scientific discoveries for health and technology, et cetera. Now, China apparently has a different worldview, or maybe they suspend those positions when it pertains to intellectual property outside China. But in any case, it's important to know there's another aspect than simply IP that needs to be enforced when you're the beneficiary of someone's estate who was a famous person. In that other area, for lack of a better way to put it, it's often called the right of publicity. The right of publicity relates to those things that are not technically intellectual property. They're the things that are associated with this famous person. So it would include their name, their likeness, their image, for example, would be a form of the likeness, their voice, signature, other things that are distinctly associated with that person. Those things, believe it or not, for most of the 20th century and before, were largely unenforceable, certainly after death. But even during your life, at least until the turn into the 20th century. So these are very important aspects of famous people, and they could simply be hijacked for money. And you could take, for example, their image and impute to it a promotion. Now, there were common law remedies. So if somebody did something that was fraudulent, or if they did something that was a defamation of that person, whether it's libel or slander, you had those laws. So if they said you endorsed something you didn't endorse, you'd have a cause of action. But it's not that they're using your fame. Your argument has to be they said something about you that wasn't true. So if in fact it can be true, then they can take and use you to promote something, and you get no money from it, and you can't technically sue for libel or slander. So there's all sorts of problems with the common laws that dealt with it. That's the reason there need to be specific statutes that spoke specifically to this subject of right of publicity. In some states or in some discussions, this is referred to as posthumous right of publicity. So what it's saying is that it's not just a matter while somebody's alive, which again, if I wasn't clear about this, most of the 20th century, if somebody's alive, they can bring those actions for somebody using their publicity, so to speak, wrongful use of publicity. That was a cause of action, either by way of a statute or what lawyers call the common law, meaning there's just cases that are precedent for bringing an action. There was that for people that were alive as of 1959. But after Buddy Holly's death, it really, to the credit of his wife more than Buddy's parents, Maria Elena, she really went to work trying to prevent people from profiting off his image. And not just a matter of money, it's a matter of controlling the value and the honor and the dignity of his image, of his signature, of him. Because whenever you take somebody's signature or voice in these things, then you're really taking that person's reputation because it's attached to those things. And she was, to her credit, she was a go-getter. She really went to legislatures. She testified. She went to work trying to preserve his memory. But also she was determined that it wasn't right for people to be able to use freely those publicity things without any accountability or payment to families. So that's what was new. Well, I won't say the first statute that was passed nationally. I would say the most prominent one was called the Buddy Holly Bill. And this was passed in Texas. And this was latter part of the 60s. Don't hold me to that. Why don't you check that, Justin, see what year it was passed? Anyway, so Texas very prominently was the most visible state to do this. And they passed a law and for them, I think it's a 50-year period after a person's death, then there has to be a payment or permission to use those things. So it's called a posthumous right of publicity. And this is the Buddy Holly bill in Texas. So similar bills were adopted in other states across the country. Now, I think 35 states have laws relating to the right of publicity posthumously. And they have different terms, incidentally. And keep in mind, these are all state laws. They're not federal. So when we're talking about intellectual property, which I think you see there's a clear distinction. Intellectual property is a conscious creation of that person in some form. And simply right of publicity just relates to the characteristics of that person, voice, appearance, image, et cetera. So one is governed by federal law, and that's very rigorously enforced. That has a different set of rules regarding how long it's enforced and the details of what qualifies and doesn't qualify for an intellectual property person, registration. As you might expect, since these things are different from this thing, the rules are very different. And also the longevity of that statute, as you might expect, should be a little longer. I mean, if you create, some world-changing invention, it's more than 50 years. It's current law, it's throughout the life of the person plus 70 years. And there's some circumstances where that can still be extended. So life of the person plus 70 years. That's a general rule for intellectual property. For things relating to posthumous right of publicity, it varies. Some states it's 40 years. I think New York it's 40 years. Texas is 50. I read of a state, it may have been Utah, that was 70. So you have to go to each state to enforce it. So it's not a matter of being able to settle it in federal court. But it is something that gives some means of enforcement and compensation. So at the time of Buddy's death, it simply was a fact that the world had not seen the phenomenon yet where after someone's death, there's so much value to be had from recordings and whatnot. Remember, you haven't had many superstars, a lot of superstars in the recording era. You had on the publicity subject, of course, since time immemorial, but on the subject of intellectual property and being able to record something, and that recording, being of such huge value, and the voice and the instruments and all those things associated with that, that was a pretty new phenomenon. So it only been around a few decades at the time, maybe 4 decades at the time of Buddy Holly's death. So the world is trying to figure out what it means. I mean, we had some, I'm thinking of superstars in the 20th century. We had Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby was definitely a superstar, Frank Sinatra, but neither of them were dead at that point. So I'm sure if you sit and think about this, you'll come up with somebody who was really, really famous and had a bunch of recordings. But I'll just say the law at that stage was not fully developed, and certainly as it pertains to the right of publicity after death. So I think that the good news about this, I guess there's good and bad here. The good news about this is the IRS in estimating the value of his estate, it was really low. It was less than $60,000, I think. We don't have all this information. Somehow these records get archived somewhere and you can't find it, even on the internet. So anyway, it's interesting, though, that she paid very little estate tax, if any. And yet we know afterwards that the nature of his success was that once he died, there was a surge associated with that in and of itself, which is now a recognized fact when the IRS values estates, is if it's a famous person, tragic death, they automatically have a premium they assign to projected revenues related to royalties over the next 2 to 3 year period. And they're basing that on a whole lot of evidence. We've seen it time and time again, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison is a really good example. No one expected him to attain the height of success that he did after he died. Jimi Hendrix, that's probably true of him too. So anyway, so at this time, though, no one knew this lay ahead. So the family, whenever half of this was given to them, you have to realize while they were appreciative, I'm going to impute that to them, that they were appreciative, they probably didn't think they'd been given the money that could support them for the rest of their lives. but they were. And what she kept would support her for the rest of her life. Because what happened was there was this surge of sales after his death. Up through 1965, you continued having songs that were charting of Buddy Holly. And in my opinion, his very best songs, charted much later. True Love Ways, which I invite you to listen to the lyrics of that song. I mean, that's such a mature perspective in terms of writing that. It seemed like it just seemed like it had a lot to say. So you may disagree, but I first really listened to this song maybe 25 years ago or so. I didn't listen to it when I was real young, but I think it's just a wonderful song. And he wrote that song to his wife just as a wedding present. And he had just recorded it, or had he not recorded it? I can't remember, but I do know it was written as a gift to her for the wedding. And I think who's the guy that did that song? He's a country artist
that recorded another version of this.
Yeah, True Love Ways. It was a number one country hit in the 70s. So it goes to show you that his work was the gift that kept on giving. And then, of course, we had the popular shows. We had the Buddy Holly. First, I guess it was the Broadway play first. Then it was this hugely successful movie with Gary Busey. My wife and I saw the Buddy Holly story on the West End of London many years ago, and I can tell you there was a line out front.
I can't believe that was 78.
Yeah, 78.
I didn't realize how long ago that was. But that's back when Gary Busey was normal. He was
young. Of course, he looked a little weird, which is kind of Buddy Holly looked a little weird.
Yeah.
So he really did suit that role.
There were a number of people that recorded that song.
Mickey Gilley.
Yeah, that's number 2 on this list. But Peter and Gordon, Mickey Gilley, Cliff Richard, Bobby V, Skeeter Davis.
Yeah, well, it became a hit in 1960 through probably the first person you named. Who was that?
Peter and Gordon?
I'm guessing. So it was a mild hit. It wasn't number one, but it became a hit in 1960, another artist. And then several people continued to do it over the years, but when Mickey Gilley picked it up in the latter part of the 70s, I mean, it was number one on the country charts.
To answer your other question, it was recorded on October 21st, 1958, so that's pretty darn close to before his death.
Oh, wow. And it was recorded by Buddy. Yeah, I've heard that recording.
Last session before his death.
Yes, I've heard that recording. The last recording session for his death. I should have thought of that because I do like his version, but I like Mickey Gilley's better. Anyway, so you had these great songs that the public. Two things went on. One is the surge, the surge that would have come if he were not as talented and of the quality that he was of a musician and artist. But then beyond the surge, there was this enduring popularity that gained momentum. So at the risk of being too repetitive here, no one knew then what the value of this was. And even Marie, she did not initially just go to work like Yoko Ono did. Yoko Ono, she's all over it. I don't even know if the funeral rights had been given, and she's this policing the borders, everything related to her husband. Man, she was a bear to deal with. But Maria was different. She was so wasted by all this. She was just devastated, and it's like she just wandered aimlessly, so to speak, for several years because she just didn't pursue things related to it. I think it was all so depressing to her, and it reminded her of the life that she thought that she was about to have, and this person she was madly in love with. There is this period of time when she didn't police it at all, and I think that was especially the period when the royalties being paid were very little, but her expectations and needs were little, and as was the family's too. So I think that another factor here is the family didn't know what to expect, so they didn't demand accountings the way they could have. So it turns out in one of these later lawsuits that they were getting paid like as little as 3% of these revenues when they're supposed to be getting something like 16%. Again, I don't know how long that went on, but that was part of the evidence in one of the lawsuits. So the family, unsophisticated, kind of rural and just not understanding anything about intellectual property. Meanwhile, we have these people in New York, among them lawyers, who really, they know. They're on the inside. They know how it works. And they felt that they could get by paying very little and that these people would think that that was what they're supposed to get. Is apparently, I don't know this is what happened. It appears to be what happened. And apparently one court, in fact, concluded, at least one court concluded that is what happened. So there's this period of time when she's not nurturing it. So there's this growth in his reputation. He's having charting number one hits in the UK. He had hits in Australia. So this is not an American phenomenon by any means. As a matter of fact, it seemed to be almost more of a UK phenomenon because they saw in him what ultimately became, the British invasion. So it's funny that preliminary to the British invasion was the American invasion, in which you had a few artists. And Jerry Lee Lewis is considered one of those. Buddy Holly's considered one of those. Little Richard, not so much Little Richard. Who's the guy here in St. Louis?
Chuck Berry.
Yeah, Chuck Berry. So these three figures I see named a lot in terms of the Americans that had a huge impact on the people who later had an impact on us, on the British invasion.
The weird cyclical thing.
It's weird, and it is cyclical. But if you really look at the start of it, they call it the British invasion. Even Brits will say it was American. I won't get off on this, but just a point I wanted to make is that, to the extent it was influenced by blues and early rock, that's American. It's just that the Brits took hold of it, and man, did they knew what to do with it.
Without early blues, there would be no Rolling Stones.
No, absolutely. So what happens, completing this story with Maria Elena, is that she ends up marrying. She marries about 5 years later. He's a Puerto Rican government official of some sort, and she maintained her relationship with Puerto Rico. She was not focused on Buddy. I think that she was so devastated and still in grief of sorts that she was continuing on with her life. And that's about the time, really. And oddly enough, it's a credit to her husband. His name was something Diego. Or is Diego his first name? Anyway, so she marries this guy who, though they get divorced not long afterwards, still they have 3 kids. Seems like a nice guy from what I've read. And he's the one who said to her, but wait, you're not doing anything to pursue the reputation of your first husband. And he was this great artist, and that. Why are you doing nothing to promote or protect his memory? Because willy-nilly, people are utilizing his reputation, his name. They're attaching him to products and services and festivals and things that this law, the Buddy Holly bill, was intended to prevent. So anyway, so it's like she kind of wakes up to this after just being through this period of several years where she doesn't give it the attention she should. And I guess we can all maybe imagine that if we or imagine her sufficiently young, sufficiently unsophisticated, and getting no guidance. She finally decides that how she wants to protect his memory, and she goes to work. And let me tell you, from then on to the day she died, and I think she's living as we speak, she's age 92.
91.
I read 92. But anyway.
Oh, maybe we missed her birthday.
The point is, though, she has been at work since, a few years after Buddy's death. She went to work, and she became hard to deal with, and I applaud that. One brouhaha that came about that she got a little bit of a black eye in the public reputation is that the city of Lubbock for years was doing a Buddy Holly festival. Now, we don't know the full story. We just know what was publicized by the city of Lubbock and the local newspaper, was that she interfered with their ability to continue using the name, that they were not going to let them call it the Buddy Holly Festival. So she was kind of viewed as kind of a Yoko Ono of sorts in that city. And I think that was undeserved. What I read was at least comments that she had made related to she wanted to be sure that it was set up in a way that would focus on her husband and not so much on other artists and et cetera. So I don't know all of that dispute, but all I know is that she pushed for this legislation to be passed that has benefited all heirs since that time of famous people. So she's really had a huge impact. She co-founded the Buddy Holly Educational Foundation, which I think is based in, is that Massachusetts? So, I mean, it's something where she's intended to encourage the artistic aspirations of people in certain fields of the arts. She's just, she dedicated her life to something worthwhile. And that was a man that she knew for only 6 months, but she knew enough to know that he was very special. Of course, he was her husband, but beyond that, he was very special, and she was determined that the world would know that. She also protected her financial interests, and I think that was a good thing. Her family was the beneficiary, meaning Buddy's parents and his siblings were the beneficiaries as well of her efforts. But also, I should add, she was the beneficiary of their efforts as well. By that I mean the parents died by, say 10 years later. Anyway, the point is that the three kids his siblings, had inherited that 50% of the intellectual property rights that she had given. Incidentally, she didn't give the right of publicity. So all those monies associated with that, branding, image, et cetera, that they did not own half of. But anyway, when the parents died, the three children each owned a third of the three siblings. And they brought in action, one I know of, in which they sued, I think it was MCA. MCA, don't have your lawyers send me a letter if it wasn't you. But anyway, so the siblings also did some things to enforce that right. They were younger, probably more little on top of things than their parents. So they kind of went to work to help assure that what was due was paid. So that was good for Maria Elena as well as them. So the good news in what would otherwise simply be a tragic story is that Buddy Holly's memory was aggressively promoted and preserved and defended into the 21st century, and as we speak is being so defended. And he ended up with a widow that was determined, a woman on fire, determined to protect him and his work. And he had siblings who also, it turns out, because of her gift, had that incentive. So they became allies of a sort. I don't know if they were ever close, to be honest with you, but they became allies in this effort. And she needed allies who were on her side of the table to help enforce and defend his memory as well as the intellectual property. So she had enough money to live well the balance of her life, and maybe she'll probably have another number of years to go. She's whether she's 91 or 92. This woman, I'm telling you, we all should have a widow that is energetic in our defense. So that's the good part of the story, is we know a lot about Buddy Holly, and we listen to his music a lot more, I think, than would have happened had these things not been adequately protected and promoted. I should also mention that Maria Elena traveled all around Europe, and not just Europe, but especially Europe, promoting his memory. UK, as we mentioned a while ago, UK, he was especially popular, and Australia, but also elsewhere. She traveled to Japan and other places. So this has been a full-time job for her, for which she's been well paid, thankfully. So I applaud what would have been simply a tragic story, that it became much better. However, now let's move to the estate planning piece as we wrap up. When you look at a situation where a 22-year-old kid, pardon the word kid, but a 22-year-old kid does not have a will, it's difficult to be too hard on him or her. I mean, it was just one of those great improbabilities. But I'm going to be a little hard, not so much on him, on the unfortunate fact that there was no one around him, that wise elder, that avuncular person who we all should have, if not a parent. If we have such a sophisticated, wise, worldly parent who can play that role, that's ideal. Often it's not a parent. When you go into different fields at the very early stages of your life, you're depending on the advice and guidance of an elder who much better understands and can give, and who cares about you and can give you good advice. As I read his story, Buddy Holly, I didn't see that there was anybody around him to occupy that role. So that's unfortunate, because had there been somebody around him, they would have said, without having to be perfectly omniscient, they would have said, look, you're married now, you have a child on the way, things can happen, let's go ahead and create a will, let's create a trust, and let's go ahead, and even if it's just a will, in the will we create a trust in which we say that if something happens to you, you appoint someone to manage the value of your assets. Now, in fairness, again, we didn't know what it would be, but he had reason to believe that certainly over time he would make a lot of money. He just didn't know that he would, he had no reason to believe it was going to be that quick and short. But still, I think that a good advisor would have said to him, look, go ahead, it's cheap, it's simple. We're not talking about elaborate estate planning. We're talking about something very simple, a 3, 4, 5-page document that's almost a form, if nothing else. I mean, in other words, I'm reaching for a very low standard here for a 22-year-old person who thinks that they might be successful, especially. But even with or without that, if they have a wife and child, that this needs to be done. But if they're going to be involved in sophisticated things, they should especially be concerned to create a trust in that will in which they designate somebody who they think is capable of managing this complex thing. And had that been done, I think that everyone would have prospered much more. Maria Elena would definitely have prospered much more, as well as things went for her, and they did. But it could have been so much better if somebody had taken hold from the beginning who is an expert in the field. So often that will be, incidentally, when you're looking for somebody to appoint who's going to be trustee of a trust, the person who's in charge of running it, they have this huge legal obligation, this fiduciary obligation to the beneficiary, which in this case is Maria, to be utterly selfless and totally conscientious. And so had that been done, that person would have taken charge, or that institution would have taken charge immediately and immediately started using their lawyers, their expertise, hiring what they don't have, meaning using independent contractors who focus. So it's not so much that the trustee, him or herself, or that particular institution, and for this it probably would be an institution, it could be a bank, could be there are trust banks or trust companies that do just that. But they have people on staff who are especially equipped and trained to handle things like intellectual property and royalty payments, et cetera. So they are able to generate the maximum value from the assets over time, which includes promoting it, et cetera. It would have been wonderful if there had been a trust where, say that there's a simple will that simply had a provision for us in the will that says all my assets will go into a trust. The trustee will be Boston Trust Company. I just grabbed a name. And that the terms would be that the money would not be distributed, the principal would not be distributed ever in total, so there'd be controls in the distribution. That would have been the ideal scenario. Maria would have had generously the money that she wanted the rest of her life. The assets would have been safe. If Boston Trust screwed up in any way, she had a deep pocket and lots of insurance for her to sue. So if things even go bad with a solid institutional trustee, you at least have recourse as opposed to Uncle Bill or doing it herself as she did much of it until later. If I'm being perfectionistic here, then that's what I would say I wish had happened. I wish that if he was going to die, if we had that scenario, then I would say, yes, do the simple will. Be sure you have the trust in place. And as important as the trust, as important is to designate the trustee. Then you know that somebody is going to be legally responsible to squeeze every nickel out of the record companies, out of any third party that's exploiting his name or reputation. That would be another thing is, I guess something we might learn is you don't hire a 21-year-old pilot who is not instrument rated when there's a blizzard. So anyway, that's all I have to say. So it's given that it starts out as a sad story, it has a happy ending. So I hope that this was of interest to you. I hope you learned something during the show. So I invite you to join me again. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Until next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.